Mr. Speaker, more evidence today that the Prime Minister has lost control over spending. The Auditor General has confirmed that this Liberal government gave $3.5 billion from the emergency fund to businesses that were not eligible. That's 10% of recipients. 77,000 businesses, and all of that administered by a consulting company that costs still more money. Doesn't that show that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost or the corruption? The Honourable Minister of Small Business.
This question is coming from the Leader of the Opposition who called our life-saving supports for small businesses big, fat government supports and quoted that the Conservatives don't believe in this kind of support. When times are tough, small businesses will not be supported by the Conservative Party of Canada. And on this side of the House, we were there to support close to 900,000 small businesses to keep them from bankruptcy and economic uncertainty. And we will continue to be there for them, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader, l'Honorable Chef de l'Opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. And now, Mr. Speaker, Canadians know that I'm right. Instead of giving businesses that deserved it some funding, the government wasted $3.5 billion. And in addition, they increased the bureaucracy by 40% to administer these programs. But that seemingly wasn't enough. So they hired Accenture, a consulting company, with another $200 million. This company is partly managed from Brazil, Mr. Speaker. Why always more consultants, more bureaucrats, and more corrupt individuals who are getting money from this government? The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about businesses. What have we done for businesses over the last week or so? We have increased the pollution pricing rebate to give that money to businesses. And last week alone, we cut GST so that there will be a GST holiday for businesses throughout Canada. And meanwhile, what is the Leader of the Opposition doing? He decided to vote against all that. Not just him, but his entire caucus. They all voted against these efforts to help business. That's what the Conservative Party of Canada represents.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
More proof today that this weak Prime Minister, has lost control of spending. The Auditor General reports that his government gave out $3.5 billion of so-called CEBA loans to companies that did not qualify, a total of 77,000 of them. That's 10% of all recipients. On top of that, they then gave a massive implementation contract to high-priced consultants at Accenture who cost $200 million and farmed out a lot of the work to Brazil. Isn't it more proof that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost or the corruption?
The Honourable Minister for Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises.
Mr. Speaker, I find it ironic because for the member from the Mission, Mesky Fraser, actually sent me a letter advocating for CEBA loans to support a small business in his own riding. You see, Mr. Speaker, he understands the value of the CEBA loans because it was a lifeline for small businesses during an unprecedented time. And so we're going to continue to help support businesses, keep their doors open, keep their lights on, and keep their employees working. Mr. Speaker, I find it's unfortunate because yet this is another example of a letter that the Leader of the Opposition did not know about.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, our members champion their constituents who are eligible for assistance. Not 77,000 companies that should not have received the $3.5 billion in misspent dollars. All this while Canadians are starving. Today, the hunger report is out from Feed Ontario, and there have been 1 million Ontarians who lined up 7 million times at the food bank after this Prime Minister brought in a carbon tax on the truckers and farmers who bring us our food. When will they axe the tax?
The Honourable Minister for Families, Children and Social Development.
Mr. Speaker, of course, we thank Feed Ontario and the food banks across this country who do amazing work. Let me quote from the report that was just mentioned. In June 2022, those over the age of 75 received a permanent 10% increase in old age security alongside inflationary increases. After that change, the percentage of food bank visitors who were seniors began to decrease. This, in addition to the measures we put forward for families, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to deliver for Canadians while they oppose at every opportunity.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, over the last 5 years, food prices in Canada have increased 37% faster than in the United States. That gap opened after the introduction of the carbon tax, which this government now, with the NDP's help, wants to quadruple. The consequence is that in the last 4 years, food bank use in Ontario is up 86%, and 1 in 4 children go to school hungry, according to this government's own data. So why won't they axe this crazy plan to quadruple the carbon tax? In fact, why not axe the tax altogether?
The Honourable Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, yet another example of the Conservative leader talking about one thing and doing another. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to supporting children, we have been negotiating school food agreements that are helping actually 200,000 children across this country, and yet the Conservative leader is opposed to that. He talks about lowering taxes, but last week he made every single one of his MPs vote against a GST tax cut for Canadians. He also talks about wanting to hold an opposition day. But we gave him an opportunity today and he ran away from it. Mr. Speaker, that's what weakness looks like when it comes to leadership. Thank you, Mr.
L'Honorable.
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, the AG report shows very clearly that the Liberals are thumbing their nose at seniors. The federal government doesn't seem to have any idea if its programs like old age security will actually help seniors. It has no idea if pension indexing actually matches inflation. They don't actually know if they should do more for seniors. And when they do get data, like the CMHC data showing that their housing strategy is letting seniors fall through the cracks, they ignore that data. So how can they preach to seniors and tell them that they're too wealthy to deserve more assistance? The Honourable Minister of Labour. Mr. Speaker, my friend across the way would be more credible if he hadn't systematically voted against all the support that we have chosen to implement during the pandemic and afterward to help our seniors, including the guaranteed income supplement increase. And yes, housing programs that will house more seniors in Quebec and throughout our country. Mr. Speaker, the Bloc Québécois is not in a position to lecture us on the topic of supporting seniors. The Honourable Member. Well, I would choose to believe the Auditor General over the Minister, and the report shows that the federal government doesn't even know or have any evidence to show whether it's helping seniors. But they do seem to know that seniors are too wealthy to deserve a pension increase from 65 to 74 years of age, a 10% increase. They seem to know that, and that seniors are too wealthy to deserve a $250 check, which is somehow still being offered to people who earn $150,000 a year. Do they also know that seniors are totally fed up with their contemptuous behavior? The Honourable Minister of Labour. Mr. Speaker, we have committed to helping seniors, despite the headwinds that we're experiencing from the other side of the House, from the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois, who are time after time systematically voting against our supports to seniors. Just think of the dental plan. We offered that to help Canadians, but the Bloc Québécois systematically voted against it. Hundreds of thousands of Quebecers are benefiting from that plan, but the Bloc Québécois is against it. It is shocking.
L'Honorable Député de Rosemont.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont, La Petite Patrie. Mr. Speaker, people are worried about their jobs. They don't have any idea whether they'll be able to pay for rent or groceries. And Donald Trump's tariffs will make that worse and make the prices of everything higher. Last week, the Prime Minister met with Trump, but other than a nice photo op, he came home empty-handed. At the very least, was he clear with the future American president that attacking Canadian and Quebec workers is unacceptable? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, my colleague is right. The tariffs that the Americans are considering will have extremely harmful effects on Canadian workers and the economy, but also harmful effects on the American economy and workers. And with that in mind, delegation spoke with President-elect Trump and his future secretaries about the integration of our two economies. We spoke about our border security, of course. It was a positive discussion, and I believe that we will be able to continue working with President-elect Trump.
The honourable member for Edmonton-Griesbach.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are worried about their jobs and whether they can afford to put food on the table. Donald Trump's unfair tariffs will threaten those jobs and jack up prices for Canadians. Last week, the Prime Minister met with him, but he has nothing to show for it, and he came back empty-handed. Canadian workers want to know, did the Prime Minister make it clear to Donald Trump that balancing the U.S. budget on the backs of Canadian workers won't work for Canada?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I don't want to disagree with my friend from Edmonton-Griesbach, but the idea that we came back empty-handed is completely false. He knows very well that we had a productive discussion with Mr. Trump and his future cabinet secretaries. The Prime Minister, of course, spoke about the importance of protecting the Canadian economy and Canadian workers from tariffs, but we also discussed with our American friends the negative impact that those tariffs could have on their economy, on an affordability in the United States as well. And Mr. Speaker, I think the commitment from President Trump to continue to work with us was far from empty-handed.
The honourable member for Thornhill.
A few short years, the Prime Minister has lost control of the deficit of immigration and of our border. He gave us a 2,500% increase in the number of unprocessed refugee claims, and he still thinks that 3 million temporary residents are going to leave this country voluntarily. Canada is staring down the barrel at 25% tariffs thanks to his open border policies, his free drugs for everyone plan, and his economic vandalism. The Prime Minister can mitigate that all today. Where's the Canada First plan to keep our borders safe?
The Honourable Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Refugees.
Mr. Speaker, these people just aren't serious. She supports the Leader of the Opposition who sat idly by in government while they cut money to border enforcement at the Canada-U.S. borders, cut at the immigration refugee border. And for those of them that are saying this is ancient history, we proposed an asylum reform package in May, and you know what the Conservatives did and the clapping seals in the back did at the Finance Committee? They voted against it and voted it down. They can support us in our asylum reform if they so choose. I encourage them to do so.
The honourable member for Thornhill.
Speaker, they've been in government for 9 years. They've known for years that immigration was out of control. They knew for years that asylum claims were out of control, and they knew for years that our border was broken. None of what newly elected President Trump has been campaigning on was a secret. And the Prime Minister even threw that minister under the bus for his incompetence in immigration. If we're going to save Canadian jobs, we need a plan yesterday to fix the disorder at the border. So I'll ask again, where is the Canada First plan to keep our border safe?
The Honourable Minister for Citizenship, Refugees and Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, this is from the gleeful authors of the Barbaric Practices Snitch Line. That was their approach to immigration when they last had a chance. We have been very serious with President Trump about our intention to secure the border. It is something that we clearly intend to do. They have an opportunity to do a number of things, and that is to support any asylum reform that we put in front of the House. I encourage them to break their silliness in the House and to do so.
Right on. The honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years, this NDP Liberal government has broken our borders. They brought in 3 million temporary residents that need to leave Canada in the next year. but they have no way to know if they will actually leave. Will they go back home? Will they stay here illegally? Will they cross over the U.S. border? And by the way, the president-elect has made it very clear that there are no more free rides for our broken borders. The bottom line is, these Liberals don't know. Mr. Speaker, we need a Canadian plan, for a Canada First plan to fix our broken borders. Where is it?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, one of the first things in our plan was to reverse some of the draconian cuts that the previous Conservative government made to the brave women and men who work in Canadian Border Services. We take the issue of border integrity and border security seriously, as do the Americans. Our discussion on Friday evening with our American friends, Mr. Speaker, was very much about the joint work that we could continue to do together. That work has been done for decades between Canadian and American law enforcement. It has kept both countries safe and secure, and we're prepared to continue to do more as well.
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister went to Mar-a-Lago to kiss the ring and returned with absolutely nothing. All while there's serious gaps in our immigration system. For example, there are over 260,000 unprocessed refugee claims right now in the system. The Liberals are paying out billions of dollars every year for hotels, food, and medical costs for these claimants. They're even allowed to work while they wait nearly 4 years to be processed. Why would people leave Canada voluntarily when they can hitch themselves to this NDP Liberal gravy train? Mr. Speaker, where is the Canada First plan to keep our borders secure?
Before I recognize the Honourable Minister, I just want to encourage all members on all sides of the House, please, out of respect for those who do depend on simultaneous translation, please allow them to hear the questions and the answers which are given in the House by not taking the floor when you're not recognized by the Speaker. The Honourable Minister for Citizenship, Immigration and Refugees.
While the Leader of the Opposition was in his basement figuring out what rhyme to put up on Twitter to express his displeasure with the government, the Prime Minister of Canada was meeting with Donald Trump, our most important partner. That is responsible. At the same time, when he's not doing that in his basement, Mr. Speaker, he's skipping around the Greater Toronto area, promising everyone and anyone visas to this country and not to deport them. That is not responsible. That's not serious. We plan to be serious.
Again, I'm going to ask all members to not take the floor unless they're recognized as the Speaker, and I'll refer specifically to the member from New Brunswick Southwest to please not do so. L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, for 9 years, we've been asking this Prime Minister to wake up and take back control of our borders. But he's doing the exact opposite. For example, in 2015, unprocessed asylum claims were less than 10,000, but today it's gone up to 260,000 cases. We have asked him for more surveillance at our borders, to cooperate more with provincial police forces, and to fight human trafficking, illegal entry, and drugs trafficking, among other problems. We have proposed a plan. Will he implement it? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, once again, on Friday, we had very cordial and constructive discussions with our American partners. We discussed border security at our shared border. We talked about integrating our law enforcement agencies with our American partners. We spoke about the important work that the RCMP is doing to fight fentanyl trafficking, drug seizures, and other operations, again, often in cooperation with our American allies. That's work that we will continue doing to support Canadian safety. The Honourable Member, Mr. Speaker, President Trump has just asked the Prime Minister to do something just now, but we've been asking for that for 9 years. We've been asking for more measures to end weapons and drugs trafficking and auto theft, but he ignores us. Weapons trafficking and auto theft are a huge problem in Quebec. We have proposed increased measures at the Port of Montreal and at the border, but nothing is changing. We have a plan. Will the Prime Minister implement it? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, our colleague across the way has a whole list of things that actually our government has accomplished. We have worked with the police services. We have done everything we could to reverse the cuts of the former Conservative government. If my colleague was really serious about national security, then I would encourage him to tell his boss to get his essential security clearance so he can actually get information to protect his own political party and his caucus. For example, Mr. Speaker, about Indian foreign interference. It would perhaps be somewhat useful for the Conservative leader to do that. The Honourable Member for Talbot. Mr. Speaker, we've had ArriveCan, and now the AG has told us about a new subcontracting scandal, the Accenture scandal. Ottawa gave $313 million to this multinational company in order to take care of implementing the CEBA business loan program during the pandemic. That's more than 5 times the cost of ArriveCan. But just like for ArriveCan, this money was granted without a bid for tender, without a spending cap, and with no kind of follow-up check. The AG says that no department took on responsibility for the program. Mr. Speaker, are the Liberals allergic to accountability? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Mr. Speaker, quite the contrary. We care about accountability, and that is why we would like to thank the AG for her hard work. Her work is rigorous and important to raise again today. And what's also important to underscore is that during the pandemic, the only thing the Conservatives wanted to do, according to their leader, was to reduce taxes for the biggest, richest businesses so that hopefully those businesses would hire the hundreds of thousands of Canadians who were losing their jobs. These kinds of measures would have led to bankruptcy for thousands of SMEs throughout the country. The Honourable Member. Mr. Speaker, nobody knows how Accenture managed to spend our $313 million, and the Liberals are refusing to tell us. The Department of Finance refused the AG's recommendation to look into the accountability gaps. They're washing their hands of the problem. This is a really low bar for accountability. With $313 million spent with no bid for tender or follow-up, the least the government could do would be to accept the AG's recommendations. If the Finance Department is refusing to look into this, I have to wonder if it's because they're worried that Quebecers will learn that they've been duped once again. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister. The emergency business account helped innumerable businesses in Quebec and elsewhere and kept them from having to turn to bankruptcy. The emergency account enabled employees to keep getting a paycheck. 4 years later, the Bloc Québécois is getting up to complain about this. Maybe they want to change the channel because last week they voted against a tax rebate. Mr. Speaker, it's hard to believe the Bloc Québécois is voting against measures that would make the lives of Canadians easier, especially during the holiday period. The Honourable Member for Talbot. Well, let's focus here. The CEO of Export Development Canada revealed at the Public Accounts Committee that $149 million were granted to Accenture. But today we've heard from the AG that actually the number was $313 million. That's more than double. So how did we get to $313 million? Well, no one wants to tell us. The department is refusing to look into it. It's shocking. Mr. Speaker, Quebecers are paying their taxes with the hope and expectation that the money will be invested intelligently, and now they can only conclude that the Liberals are once again abusing their trust. The Honourable Minister for Small Business. Mr. Speaker, I find the Bloc Québécois' position hypocritical because they would have promoted policies that actually led to higher costs. Small businesses were just asking for help to keep their doors open and to keep people working, and we did help them. Small businesses know that we will always be there to stand up for them.
The Honourable Member for Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Speaker, for 8 consecutive years, food bank usage has risen in Ontario, a timeline that matches the corruption and incompetence of the NDP Liberal government. They caused the cost of living crisis, a crisis where even 25% of Ontarians who have jobs need to use the food bank. Canadians deserve relief from this cost of living crisis. So will the Prime Minister cancel his plans to quadruple the carbon tax and call a carbon tax election now?
The Honourable Minister for Families, Children and Youth.
Well, great news, Mr. Speaker. Last week I was in PEI where we announced another province that has signed on to the National School Food Program. That's 184,000 kids this school year that will receive food at school, almost 1.5 million more meals at school, Mr. Speaker, for a program that the Leader of the Opposition contends doesn't exist. I challenge him to ask those 184 children who are getting food at school. They'll school him, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's the NDP Liberals that have caused this cost of living crisis. More than 1 million Ontarians had to use a food bank last year. The NDP Liberals still can't do basic math. They still don't understand that if you tax the farmer who grows the food and tax the trucker who ships the food, you're taxing the families who then buy the food. So this Prime Minister has completely lost touch with reality. So will he take a walk in the snow and call a carbon tax election now?
Order. The Honourable Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative members of Parliament are so ridiculous. They had an opportunity today to put forward a vote of the confidence in the government, and they decided not to, Mr. Speaker. So yet again, we see Conservative MPs talking out of one side of their mouth, but when it comes time to acting, they just can't deliver. Mr. Speaker, we are here to work for Canadians, and we're doing real things that are delivering for real Canadians, like school food programs, like the Canada Child Benefit, like dental care, that are helping Canadians make ends meet while all they do is puff hot air. Thank you, Mr.
Speaker. Order. The Honourable Member from Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Speaker, while the Liberals try to distract Canadians with tax tricks on Christmas trees and alcohol, more than 1 million Ontarians turn to the food bank to feed themselves. Food bank use has risen in 8 of the 9 years this NDP Liberal government has been empowered. In the last 2 years alone, food bank usage in Ontario has risen by 73%. Wow. Worse, almost 25% of those food bank users had jobs, providing more evidence that the Prime Minister's cost of living crisis is deepening. Canadians have had enough, Speaker. Will the Prime Minister do the right thing? Call a carbon tax election right now.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance.
Giving a tax break to Canadians is real, Mr. Speaker. When you go to the cash, when you're trying to buy your kids Christmas presents, you're not going to pay GST. When you go to cash at the grocery store, you're not going to pay GST on everyday items, Mr. Speaker. When you go to the restaurant, either. This is real money back in the pockets of Canadians. The Conservatives talk about vulnerable Canadians who are having a rough time. They vote against support for Canadians on every single occasion. They stand up in this House and oppose a tax break. They're opposing a tax cut, Mr. Speaker. The Conservative Party of Canada, they've lost all sense.
The Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
It's unacceptable that 1 in 5 emergency rooms in Ontario had unplanned shutdowns this year. The Prime Minister's praise of Doug Ford's innovation in healthcare resulted in 2024 being the worst year for emergency room closures in Ontario. The Liberals have given Ford billions of dollars in no strings attached healthcare funds, only for more closures and uncertainty. Ontarians deserve better. Will the Prime Minister take responsibility for funding Doug Ford's privatization scheme, or will he continue to leave Ontarians waiting?
The Honourable Minister for Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, those agreements that were $200 billion over 10 years absolutely did come with common indicators and shared priorities. In fact, we just saw Kai Hai's report showing for the first time in Canadian history actually in data where we are. And what that data shows us is that nearly every jurisdiction across the country has more doctors, more nurses, that surgical wait times are back to where they were at the before the pandemic, and that we're making really important progress. It's essential that provinces step up and do their part, but we're making really important progress in our health system.
The Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Mr. Speaker, border officers want to do their part in protecting Canada, but they need more tools to help stop the flow of toxic drugs, stolen cars, and guns. The Conservative leader fired over 1,100 border officers when he was in cabinet, including sniffer dogs and frontline staff, and the Liberals never hired them back. New Democrats have been calling on the government for years to invest more in CBSA frontline workers. Will the Liberals stop letting people down and hire back the officers the Conservatives fired and give them the tools they need to do their job?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank our colleague from Windsor West for that question and share his support for the extraordinary women and men that work for the Canadian Border Services Agency. Like him, I've had an opportunity to meet many of these women and men who serve in the security of our country and do very important work. I was glad he highlighted the draconian cuts that the previous Conservative government made to the Border Services Agency. I'm happy to tell him, Mr. Speaker, that we have reversed those cuts. We've hired considerably more Border Services officers. And the good news, Mr. Speaker, is we're going to continue to do more as well.
That's right.
The Honourable Member for Richmond Hill.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader has built its reputation on bashing taxes, and yet when this government puts forward the tax break that will benefit all Canadians, he says no. Can the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development explain why this GST tax break for Canadians is so important and why the Conservative leader and his party would vote against a tax break that helps everyday people? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister for Families, Children and Social Development.
This tax break is exactly the kind of relief that Canadians need right now. The Conservative leader contends to be a champion of taxpayers, but when given the opportunity to axe a tax, not this one, Mr. Speaker. Conservative MPs are turning their back on Canadians. While they may prefer slogans over solutions, on this side we'll continue to deliver for Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Midnapore.
After 9 years of this Liberal NDP government, Canadians are worse off. The U.S. GDP is up 2.8%, while the Canadian GDP is only up 1%. The Canadian GDP per capita is down 0.4%. This is the sixth consecutive quarter in which the Canadian GDP has been down. This Prime Minister does not have a plan. So will he step aside for a Prime Minister who does?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of, to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance.
I think that member is misreading the numbers. Actually, Statistics Canada just revealed that they needed to revise the GDP numbers upwards for the last 3 years, Mr. Speaker. Canada is expected to have the highest GDP growth in all of the G7 next year, Mr. Speaker. I think what the Conservatives are trying to do is to change the channel. You see, just a few days ago, they opposed a tax break, Mr. Speaker. They opposed cutting the GST from everyday goods for Canadians, and they don't know how to explain it.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years, Canada faces yet another threat to its economy. The U.S. has threatened a 25% tariff on all goods exported from Canada. This greedy government has increased taxes with the carbon tax, housing taxes, increased capital gains taxes. Mr. Speaker, this is not just bad vibes. So will the Prime Minister admit that it's not bad vibes, but bad policy that forces Canadians to suffer?
Here.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Export Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday, the Prime Minister led a Canadian delegation to Florida to meet with President Trump. They had a productive discussion on border and economic security, including the impacts tariffs will have on both Canadian and American consumers. In 2018, it was this government that renegotiated NAFTA, which led to record trade just last year of $1.3 trillion, Mr. Speaker. As we have done through 3 American administrations, we will continue to stand up for Canadian workers and Canadian businesses. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Lefjord. Mr. Speaker, once again this morning we found out that yet another sawmill is closing. Rapide des Joachim sawmill in Pontiac is the latest to get a taste of the weakness of this Liberal government. 10% of the town's workforce will lose their jobs. The economic repercussions for the town will be catastrophic. The threat of becoming a ghost town hangs over the village, just as it did in Sacré-Cœur in my region with the Caribou Decree. Why didn't the Prime Minister come back from Mar-a-Lago with any gains for forestry workers? When are we going to have an election?
Development and international trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member through you for that very important question. Mr. Speaker, the softwood lumber industry is very important to our government. We know it represents thousands of jobs from British Columbia down to Quebec, down to Eastern Canada. We will always stand up for Canadian softwood lumber. We stood up for Canada when the U.S. imposed aluminum and steel tariffs on us. And what did the Conservatives? They asked us to capitulate and back down. We have a proven track record to negotiate good trade deals. We will always stand up for lumber workers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Lefjord. Mr. Speaker, 23 workers have been laid off. And how many other indirect jobs depend on the factory in a village of just 188 residents? The threat of becoming a ghost town is very real. This is all because of the Liberal government's failure to reach an agreement on softwood lumber. This is the 4th sawmill in Quebec to announce its closure in just a few months. Our workers need a strong leader. When will we have an election so that we can elect the Conservative leader to be Prime Minister? The Honourable Minister of Fisheries, Oceans and the Coast Guard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're very disappointed that the American Department of Trade increased unfair, unjustified duties on Canadian softwood lumber. This is incredibly unfair and it is harmful to both producers and consumers on both sides of the border. Canadian workers are being punished by unfair tariffs, and this will also harm American lumber companies. The United States Department has to find a good, lasting solution, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. Mr. Speaker, last week, on behalf of the Bloc Québécois, I tabled a bill that, if passed, would contribute significantly to the fight against organized crime. Not only would our bill create a list of criminal organizations, but it would also hit the bullseye by requiring members of these organizations to prove that their assets are not proceeds of their criminal activities. This would effectively reverse the burden of proof. This would send a clear message to criminals, Mr. Speaker. Will the government take up our bill and start taking the fight against organized crime seriously? The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate this question because it addresses a very serious matter. Organized crime has increased here in Canada. What we are experiencing is that we need to address the situation. We made changes through Budget 2024 and the 2023 Fall Economic Statement for funding of organized crime. We also took action on car theft by investing more at the borders, and so car thefts have decreased by 40% in Quebec. Those are the results that this side of the House is delivering. The Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. Mr. Speaker, gang wars are on our streets.
gangs put bounties on journalists. They kill innocent people by setting fire to businesses. They even shoot each other in broad daylight. They even take each other out in federal prisons. And what's the government doing? Where is the government? The government is doing nothing, and it is nowhere. The Liberals could send a strong message to gangsters and pass our bill, but no. While they're dilly-dallying, the gangs continue to lay down the law and bring their wars to our streets. When will the government start taking the fight against organized crime seriously? The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General. When we have conferences and meetings with our counterparts, including Ministers Bonnardel and Jolin Barrette, we talk about investments. We have invested $132 million in our Guns and Gangs initiative, which especially helps Quebec. We also invested $42 million to make our communities safer. Through our investments, we have made significant efforts, and we have succeeded in reducing organized crime-related incidents such as car thefts. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I agree with the NDP leader who said the Liberal government will always step in to make sure unions have no power. The minister's Section 107 referrals took away workers' rights to strike. As a result of this, Conservatives believe that this Liberal government has lost the confidence of the House of Commons. Now, this puts the NDP and the NDP leader in a tough spot. Will he support his own words, support workers, or continue to prop up this NDP Liberal government? Or will the government throw their coalition buddy a line and call a carbon tax election?
Order. Order. The Honourable Minister of Labour and Seniors.
Mr. Speaker, you would think this was not from the party that supported the anti-union oppressive Bill C-377 and Bill C-525. You would think this wasn't from the party who has in its own policy handbook the fact that they will be bringing in right-to-work Alabama-style legislation into this House. You would think that that wasn't the party that refused to debate that very motion this morning in this House of Commons.
Order. The Honourable Member from Dufferin-Caledon.
So his defense of his decision to take away a worker's right to strike is to talk about some things from a few years ago. Unions have unilaterally condemned the Section 107 referrals, and the NDP leader said he intervenes to take away unions' power. That's true. He took away the Teamsters' right to strike. He took away the ILWU's 514's right to strike. But when Unifor 1541 asked him to intervene to prevent union busting, this minister disappears. But the leader of the NDP has a choice to make. Will they keep propping up these guys that make these anti-worker decisions, or will he just stand with his words and vote against?
I'm going to ask all members, please, to remind themselves that they have to keep their voices down so that those who participate using translation can hear the interpretation. The Honourable Minister of Labour and for Seniors.
You would think that wasn't the party that opposed 10 sick days for employees in federally regulated industries. You would think that that was a party that didn't have right-to-work Mississippi-style legislation in its policy platform. You would think that wasn't the party whose very leader decried the involvement of unions in the procurement and other processes. Mr. Speaker, this Conservative Party is anti-worker. They've proved it on every single occasion that they're able to do it, and we will always stand for workers in this country.
The Honourable Member from Peterborough-Kawartha.
Today, the truth will be revealed. The Conservatives have put forward a non-confidence motion using the quote from the NDP leader where he said the Prime Minister is greedy and anti-worker. So what will it be? Will the leader of the NDP sell out Canadians yet again, or has that Prime Minister made another backroom backroom deal that puts both of their lust for power over the rights of Canadians.
The Honourable Minister for Seniors and for Labour.
I guess that member's back from announcing the housing projects in her riding that she voted against in this House of Commons. It is a joke, Mr. Speaker. It is a sick joke to watch these Conservatives line up behind this leader and his fake, false bravado, putting motions on the floor of this House. Then we ask them to debate those very motions. What do they say? No, Mr. Speaker. They refuse to debate their own motion. They will not debate help for Canadians. They will not debate tax cuts. They will not debate any support for Canadians in this House of Commons. This is a sick joke.
Order. Order. S'il vous plaît.
Order, please.
Order. L'honorable député de Châteauguay-Lac.
The Honourable Member for Châteauguay-Lacolle. Mr. Speaker, the global pandemic made things difficult for the hospitality industry, the tourism industry, and many of our retailers and restaurants too. Through programs like the Canada Emergency Business Account, our government stepped up to help businesses through that difficult time. Now, my constituents want to know what we're doing to help them post-recovery. Can the Minister for the Environment and Climate Change tell us about the government's plan? The Honourable Minister for the Environment and Climate Change. I thank my colleague for her question. We're always there for Canadian families and Canadian businesses in good times and in bad times. Twice, though, we proposed tax cuts for the middle class, and on both occasions, the Conservative leader voted against the tax cuts and forced his party to join him in doing so. Today, with our GST cut, we are providing even more support for families and businesses. You'd think that the Conservatives would support this, but the only tax cuts they seem to support are for their rich friends and for big oil companies. It's always the same old story for the Conservative Party. Their interests and their friends' interests first, the interests of Canadians second.
For Calgary Forest Lawn.
The Auditor General exposed $3.5 billion for ineligible CEBA loans thanks to this incompetent Liberal NDP government. They were too incompetent to run this program themselves, so they gave a sole source contract to Accenture, a multinational corporation that gave most of the work to Brazilians, not Canadians. Canadians got taken to the cleaners for more than $300 million. Why are third-party contractors running this government and covering up ministers' incompetence?
Good job. Good job. The Honourable Minister for Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises.
Mr. Speaker, it's nice to know that there exists a report that the opposition can read without a security clearance. The member opposite and his party claim every single time that they care about small businesses, when in fact every single time we put efforts and support forward for small businesses, they always vote against it and decline everything that we do. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, the CEBA loans were there and helped nearly 900,000 small businesses keep their lights on, keep their doors open, and keep their employees working. We will continue to be there to support small business, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Mission Mashpee Fraser Canyon.
Mr. Speaker, today the Auditor General released a bombshell report on the Canada Emergency Business Account. It highlights serious inefficiencies, a lack of government oversight, and $3.5 billion in losses to ineligible recipients. So how did we get here? The report outlined that the third-party program administrator, Accenture, set their own pricing, wrote their own contracts, ran procurement, and received 19 uncompetitive contracts for $313 million. Why can't the Liberals administer a government program without breaking a conflict of interest law?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises.
Mr. Speaker, I already talked about the fact that there exists a report that they can read that they don't need security clearance for. So here's the real bombshell, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to security clearance, there are more allegations that have come forward with regards to foreign interference in the Conservative Leadership Party race. Yet the Conservative leader chooses to ignore these security breaches in his own party. If the Conservative leader actually cared, he'd have nothing to hide. So, Mr. Speaker, can the leader of the Conservative Party get the clearance, take the briefing, and protect this country?
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General came down hard on Liberal corruption this morning. She revealed that $3.5 billion from the Canada Emergency Business Account was paid to companies that were ineligible. Worse yet, as in this case of the ArriveCan scandal, it was a private company, in this case Accenture, which established the criteria and costs of its own contract with the government. Mr. Speaker, why are the Ministers of Finance and Foreign Affairs continuing to illegally reward a private company at the expense of Canada's hard-hit small and medium enterprises? The Honourable Minister of Tourism and Economic Development. The Economic Development Agency, rather. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will repeat some of what my colleagues have said earlier. Just in case the colleague didn't hear the interpretation earlier, we're glad that the party is able to read through a report that they don't need a security clearance for. It's a public document that is available to the public. Now, there are thousands of businesses from coast to coast to coast that would not have survived the pandemic without our government's support. That's what we're here for. We're here to ensure that businesses can pay their employees, pay their expenses, and that they were able to remain resilient throughout the most significant pandemic in history.
Richmond Hill.
Mr. Speaker, we're in the midst of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. This campaign unites people across the country and the world to call out and speak up against acts of gender-based violence. Unlike the Conservative Party, our government has never wavered in supporting survivors of gender-based violence or investing in prevention. Could the Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Youth update the House on our government's commitment to addressing this crisis?
The Honourable Minister.
Our theme, Come Together, Act Now, Mr. Speaker, emphasizes that everyone plays a part, especially men and boys, to change attitudes and behaviors that contribute to gender-based violence. And this dangerous behavior is pervasive. Even the leader of the Conservative Party embedded misogynistic hashtags in his YouTube videos. Canadian women remember, Mr. Speaker. Our government won't ever back down on supporting survivors. We created the first national action plan to end gender-based violence, backed by more than $500 million. We will not relent until every woman is safe.
The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples continue to be killed by the RCMP. In less than a month, 9 Indigenous peoples were killed without consequence. The RCMP and provincial authorities must respond towards reconciliation. Indigenous peoples deserve justice. Victims and their families deserve justice. When will this government finally work with Indigenous peoples and law enforcement towards Indigenous justice?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, we thank our colleague for that important question and obviously share her concern and the concern of all Canadians when we see these tragic outcomes. I've talked to the RCMP, the Commissioner, the leadership of the RCMP about this. I've had a chance to talk to Indigenous leaders and territorial premiers about this. We share our colleagues' concern about moving towards a circumstance where we can have more Indigenous police forces and include Indigenous communities in the important law enforcement that Canadians expect in their communities and that we want to do in partnership with them. And we'll continue to do that important work, Mr. Speaker, and think of the families of these victims at all times.
The Honourable Member for Spadina Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, Canada's border and immigration are key issues for the incoming Trump administration.
It's no surprise the immigration minister was left out of the Prime Minister's Mar-a-Lago visit, given that it's his failures that have now placed our economy at risk. With IRGC agents hiding behind the refugee program to avoid deportation, can the public safety minister, who did make the trip and whose department finally got around to designating the IRGC as a terrorist that they are, share what he's doing to kick out every single terrorist from Canada? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister for Citizenship, Immigration and Refugees.
Again, Mr. Speaker, we see a member of the House constantly making things up. We are very, very concerned about any foreign agent working in Canada, whether it's as part of any purported terror. The enforcement agencies in our country work diligently to clamp down on these people, to arrest them, to bring them to justice, or to kick them out of the country. Will continue to do so. Thank you.
Je voudrais signaler